the people who made these accusations, when they die, St. Peter himself is gonna punt them off the staircase. Okay? He has no time for this shit. Moses said it himself. Stop coveting your neighbor's wife. Stop it. Punt. Welcome back to the madness. My name is Erin, and I will be your guide today as we go deep down into the delirium. Today's book is The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson, and the audiobook narrator, her name is Brianna Collette. Brianna Collette did a very good job narrating this audiobook, which is, when I think back to it, I feel so what's the word? Spoiled. I feel so spoiled. Because I just finished the book, The Cabin at the End of the World, and the audiobook narrator for that one was not good at all. And I was like, I can't believe that this was put on a shelf for people to listen to. So, Brianna Collette, it's been a while since I've read this book and heard your lovely voice, but I want you to know that I miss you. I miss you. Lumpy, the narwhal, also misses you. The first thing we're going to do as we look in about this book is we're actually going to look at the novel concept and just break down what this book says is going on in this book. You know, when you're reading the back or you're looking up on Goodreads, this is the stuff that everyone is going to know, the premise, the synopsis. It prepares you for going in. It tells you if you're going to like the book or not, right? So let's go take a look at that. Okay, so the first thing that we get at the top here is it says, a young woman living in a rigid, puritanical society discovers dark powers within herself in this stunning feminist fantasy debut. So, the important words here are... Does that highlight the whole thing? Can I not just highlight a word? Puritanical. There we go. Right, puritanical, dark powers, feminist fantasy debut. These are sort of the key words, and that's why that sentence is there. So when we look at this premise, this concept, the things that are jumping out are definitely all of the capitalized words. We have Bethel, we have prophet, we have Emmanuel Moore, and then we also have protocol, our holy protocol, Father, Darkwood, church. So these are the big words that are jumping out of us. Obviously, that tells us that these our titles are far more important than we think. Obviously, the only one that out of here that is probably, the one that is the strangest and the one that we want to know about is going to be Darkwood, because, Father, Holy Protocol, Prophet, Church, we kind of understand what those words are, and we know what Darkwood is. I mean, dark wood, but we don't know what that means in the world of Bethel. So these are sort of just the big words that are coming out at us. Other things that we see, we have outsider of a different race, so we understand that there's going to be some sort of race dialogue that's happening in here, and then we get some sort of keywords that hint at theme, which is submission, devotion, absolute conformity, and then of course we have all other women in the settlement. So obviously we've got race, we've got women. We're getting a better understanding of what exactly is going on. We're getting a sense of the themes. And then here, this section, this is just plot. This is what's going to happen. She's lured in here, and she gets the journal of her dead mother. So this is an object that we're going to be looking out for. When we read the book, we're going to be like, okay, we know that there's this journal. That's the thing we're expecting. So we understand that all of the build-up is going to be building us up to this journal. That is sort of the promise that is being told in this premise. We're going to find this. And we get a hint about her family, which is dead mom. Emmanuel can almost be classified as a Disney princess. Welcome to the club. We also get a hint into sort of what the conflict that Emmanuel is going to have. We have struggling to understand how her mother could have consorted with the witches, so we understand that there is this sort of dichotomy of the witches versus the city of Bethel, and that is going to be causing Emmanuel some stress. And then, kind of typical of what you would expect in a story like this, the more she learns, the more she understands how messed up her society is. And, if Bethel is to change, it must begin with her. And it doesn't really give like a chosen one kind of vibe, even though you could argue that this book uses a chosen one trope, not into any bad way. I think the chosen one situation in which Emmanuel is chosen is actually very fascinating, and I really liked it. But, she is the one who is learning all of these things, so she takes it upon herself to be the person of change. And I think that is an interesting way to go about it. So that is our novel concept. These are all the big things. These are the things that we are expecting to see, especially because, it says it's a feminist fantasy debut, so we understand that we are going to be having some sort of thematic discussions about femininity, specifically with a puritanical society. For a puritanical society, we sort of expect a fear of the unknown, women, and the idea of not being a virgin. Those are the three scariest things in a puritanical society. Emmanuel Moore and Hester Prynne are enemy number one. Hi, I stopped recording because every time I used the red marker, my screen would blink black, and so I went to go watch that clip just to see if it did it. In the clip, it doesn't. So I look insane when those parts are happening, and if you're wondering, why does she switch to the rainbow pen? It's because the rainbow pen didn't glitch like the red pen. So that's why that was happening. Anyways, back to what we were talking about. So novel execution evaluates if what is detailed in the premise is what we see in the novel itself. And for The Year of the Witching, I would say it's pretty accurate. Everything that we see in here comes into play. The Journal of the Dead Mother is a very central and important thing for the cohesion of the entire story. If Bethel is to change, it very much does kind of befall to Emmanuel to do it. And the Society of Bethel is submission, devotion, absolute conformity, following the holy protocol, all of that. It is there to a T. So the execution of it was great. I wouldn't say that Emmanuel struggles with the revelation about her mother Miriam. It says, what does it say? Struggling to understand how her mother could have consorted with the witches. That I don't really think is as important as the premise makes it out to be, because Miriam is sort of seen as a bad guy up until the very end, which we'll get into. So that part was a little iffy. And then the history about the church. She says she begins to learn the grim truths about the church and its history, and starts to realize that the threat to Bethel is its own darkness. Basically, the threat of Bethel is the system that was built that oppresses women. And it does oppress Black people. I would say that oppressing women, it takes a more central focus than on its oppression of Black people. But I obviously do not have the melanin to make any sort of commentary other than to say it is also there. So I feel like we didn't go into the history enough. What we learn is kind of what you would expect of a puritanical society that hates women and Black people. It's about, as, everything that you would expect. That is what Emmanuel learns. And there are points where I think we could have gone deeper where we didn't. I do think that Henderson meant to have that history come to life. I just don't think that it didn't come to light as well as she might have thought it did. But, and as I'm saying that and criticizing that, these are really small hiccups in the grand scheme of the story, and it's not like it took me out of the story. I still rated the execution 5, even though of these couple of hiccups. They really are just small details. I just noticed them because I think too much about every piece of media I consume. I'm going crazy. Lumpy agrees. Ultimately, this book executes its premise as best as it possibly could, and honestly, what more could anybody ask? Alright, so let's actually look at the cover. So the cover was created by, what is his name? I wrote his name down. Larry Rostand, and the cover was designed by Katie Anderson. You guys did a great job. This is a beautiful cover. I always think that she kind of looks like the girl from, is it Ginny and Georgia or Georgia and Ginny? I don't know which one it is, but she looks like the girl from that. Every time I see her, that's what I think of. And in terms of a visual representation of what we saw in the novel concept, we see the woods, right? Trees. And then we've also got, her hands in prayer. So when we think about puritanical societies and holy protocols and things like that, prayer is very important. Her hands look kind of weird, but she's doing this, which is why it looks a little weird. And this is not normally what we associate with prayer. Prayer is usually like this, but I do think that this is a good way to still represent that her hands are clasped. I still like that. And also, if you're tying somebody's hands, their hands are going to be kind of tied like this. And so that, we have that dual interpretations of hand in prayer, but also hands are bound. Love that. And then you can't really see it, but there are, let me see what if I just zoom in all the way? There are blood stains all over this. And I think that is a cool detail because the first plague is blood. And this city is entrenched in, killing women. And so everyone has blood on their hands, and there's just this smattering of blood. And I really liked that detail. I didn't notice it until I was sitting down and looking at this, and I was like, oh, wow, there's blood everywhere. And then I like the black and white color of it. Makes it seem older than it is, right? Those old ancient photographs that before color, so that it gives it a more puritanical vibe or a more ancient vibe because we've got the black and white color. And then I think just adding it with the gold, it looks great because the gold then really, really pops out. And of course, this is dark fantasy, dark biblical fantasy, gothic, and things like that. And, the sort of black and white more older aesthetics are important when trying to visualize that, which is why I also think they went with a black and white image. I think the gold again is just another great accent color. This is a great cover. This is a beautiful cover. The other cover is pure white, and then it has I don't know which symbol it is because I didn't count the lines, but it's either the wedding symbol that gets carved into the prophet's bride's foreheads, or it's the symbol that the witches have. It's one of those two things. I'm not entirely sure. But that cover is also really good because it's just blank space and then the black symbol, and then you're like, oh, you want to know what does that mean? That's an interesting symbol. And then when you're reading the book and you're hearing about the symbols with the forehead, you can logically conclude, oh, that's what that must be. That cover poses a question to the reader, what does this symbol mean? And that, I think, is an effective use of a cover. The Year of the Witching as a title does well. And it fits the novel well. I like that it's a piece of world building. In Bethel, every year is labeled as something. I don't remember what year it's supposed to be. It's been a bit since I've read the book, so I don't quite remember what the name of that year is. But I believe that it's Emmanuel's grandmother who says something like this year should have been called the Year of the Witching with all of the witchcraft that is happening, or something like that. Where this title falls short and why I kind of rated the title as a 3 is that I love the fact that it is a piece of world building and then it asks the reader a question, what is it to mean Year of the Witching? What does that mean? we don't get a lot of lore as to the rituals that come with naming it. We don't know exactly who names it, why they name it, what goes into it. We don't get a lot of details about that, and that I feel like is such a missed opportunity. And, with it being the title, it's like I want to know what that is. Part of that, especially for me, because I'm a title person. I'll read a book with an ugly cover, but if it's a bad title, I will not pick it up. So I always want to know more about the titles, and so I was just kind of disappointed that we got some information about it, but we didn't get a lot of information. And there's enough lore that I could extrapolate an answer. It's probably got something to do with the way that prophets can see into the future, or Emmanuel's grandmother has this ability where she knows the names of babies. That is a magical thing that happens, or a blessing that happens. So I also wonder, is there someone who just like that knows the names of the years? So there's room for theory crafting, which is great. I just wish I had more hard evidence that I could build up a very well thought out and hard to break theory versus what feels like grasping at some vague things to extrapolate an answer. Alright, now that we're done looking at the metadata, it's time to actually open the book up and see what is inside of here. So first let's look at the prose. Anything, I should probably turn those lights on, huh? Anything that has to do with the physical structure of the book, the organization, the chapters, the sentence work, all of that is under prose. The writing is very beautiful. If you go and you look at the reviews on Goodreads, you will see in the higher ratings, you will see a lot of them being look at this quote and look at that quote. She writes very beautifully. It's very impressive. It's very good. And the voice of Emmanuel is clear and distinct. She feels unique in comparison to the other characters around her, which is a very good selling point. I read a book recently where I was losing track of who was who because everyone sort of sounded the same. It wasn't very helpful. It is a very fast-paced book, and I didn't have a problem with it. Other people did. I didn't. I was fine with it. Sometimes maybe it's a little too fast. I was very shocked to see that, these fabled witches that are, almost ghost stories in this town are met within, the first few chapters. That was kind of shocking, but once I got over that initial shock and understood the pace of this book, I was raring to go, and I was fully accepted that this was going to be very fast-paced. It kept me very engaged, and I was I read it in only a couple of days because something was always happening, which is a great, refreshing break from novels where nothing happens for 40 straight pages. Books that overextend their stay should be a war crime. Am I upset about The Cabin at the End of the World? Yes. That would have been a great short story. It did not need to be a 9-hour-long audiobook. Although, I did see it get adapted into a movie, and honestly, I think it would be a better movie than a book. So I'm gonna go watch the movie. I probably might even love the movie, but man, I did not love that book. Now let's look at the plot. So the main plot revolves around Emmanuel Moore. She is a biracial child, which the town of Bethel doesn't really like because they are racially stratified. Her mother rejects the advances of the prophet. Anyways, the prophet's like, I want you to be my wife. And then Emmanuel's mother's like, and he's like, you don't have a choice. And she's like, I'm gonna run away with my lover. And then they burn the lover to the stake. And then Emmanuel's mother is like, I'm still not gonna marry you. And she fucks off to the woods, discovers these witches, and goes insane. We'll come back to Mom. I'm sorry, Lumpy. Thank you for participating. So, the city of Bethel is seen as the realm of the father and masculine, and the woods are seen as the realm of the witches and the realm of the mother and femininity. New genders just dropped. If you live in the city, you're a man. If you live out in the boondocks, you're a woman. Emmanuel is basically, she's lured out into the woods, discovers lesbians, and also a notebook which has which is the diary of her dead mother. And this book, this diary, details the prophecy of the 4 plagues, which is blood, blight, darkness, slaughter, which awesome. I love the name of all of those plagues. I can't wait to see how that's going to turn down. Doesn't really look good for Bethel. Emmanuel is bonded to these plagues through like a magical witchcraft ritual, and so it is up to her to stop them because like the power of the plagues is connected to her soul. But the oppressive state of Bethel basically sees as, instead of, Emmanuel as the victim having her soul involuntarily tied to these plagues, Bethel sees her as the cause of the plagues, which is not inherently wrong, but it's also not really true. And so they basically want to get rid of, not Bethel wants to get rid of her, but the prophet is like, either you're burning at the stake or you're going to be my wife. Either way, I'm going to have control over you and the plagues inside of your body, whether you like it or not. That section where we are dealing with Emmanuel's choices, that's in the last act. It's very good. It's very tense. Lilith and her 3 witches show up to Emmanuel on like the day where Emmanuel is making these choices, and Emmanuel stops them. I don't remember how she stops them. I think she harnesses the powers of the plagues, and she like kills all of the witches in a very badass moment, and it's very cool. And then the prophet makes it out at the end, and Emmanuel chooses to spare the prophet because killing him would mean she's just as bad as him. Someone take me out. The plot moves very fast. I think that's fine. It didn't bother me. Where the plot stammers the most is what it wanted to do with Emmanuel Moore. Not Emmanuel Moore. Miriam Moore, Emmanuel's mother. So this book goes back and forth if Miriam is a victim or if she's a villain. Clearly, she was trying to escape the prophet's unwanted advances, and her lover was burned at the stake for it, and she fled into the woods. It's clear that she is a victim of the prophet, but she is the one who uses like magic to bind Emmanuel to these plagues. So in that sense, she's kind of seen as a villain. And the book reconciles these two by saying that Miriam was driven insane by Lilith, the queen of the witches, to do this, and Lilith's actually the bad guy, and Miriam is just a victim pawn driven to insanity and is actually just a victim. We will talk about the thematic contradictions in a later section, but for right now, I want to say that I was not a fan of the insanity plotline. The decision to be like Miriam was driven insane, I wasn't a fan of that. It felt very needless. It felt contrived. It felt like it was trying to make... Stop eating plastic. I found it very interesting that Miriam truly, like, embodied victims become villains and is sort of a product of the toxic system that is how Bethel functions as a city. And it made me start to understand how, like, Lilith, Delilah, Yael, and Mercy became these villainous witches. Not necessarily sympathetic, but, when you have such an oppressive patriarchal system that villainizes women this much, eventually you get to a point where it's like, why would you expect women to be anything different if this is the only option that they can become? If you create such a suffocating society in which this is the only option, why are you surprised that we're here? But all of that emotion is kind of lost when Lilith is just a bad guy. That we don't explore anything about her and the original witches and what exactly happened that drove them out into the woods. We don't necessarily know that. I honestly was expecting us to learn that they were like the wives of the original first prophet, David Ford. But we never got that. And I wanted there to be more connection to connect them to Miriam to the city, and I feel like we just didn't get there. The plagues were very cool. I can see the biblical references in them. The way that Alexis Henderson decided to interpret them was all very cool, all very good. Loved the plagues. I'm a plague girly. Love it. The villains were also great. The prophet was like big and scary. Judith was antagonistic and a little sympathetic. I really liked Judith as a villain. And then kind of Emmanuel's grandmother is a little villainous. I also loved her. All of the bad guys in this story were very good and very entertaining. This was a very good plot. I rated it 4. Characterization. I'm abusing you, I'm sorry. At times, the cast of characters is kind of exactly what you would expect out of a book that is dealing with a puritanical society and witches. So there's Emmanuel, who's a good girl, a shy girl. She loves to read. And then there's the prophet's son. He's going to be the new leader, and he thinks sexism is bad. And when he becomes ruler, he's going to make big changes. Except for the system is very hard to change at this point in time, and so he struggles a lot. Because, this is an ancient system, and one upstart, it's going to take more than just one upstart to get this rolling. We have, major purity culture values, and people are hypocrites about it. Obviously, all of the men in power are not adhering to these standards. The women in power are not adhering to these standards. And of course, the women get punished and the men don't. These are things that we would expect. The characters that I think were the most interesting in terms of the society at large and the themes that were being explored are actually Emmanuel's grandparents. They're fairly minor characters, but I love them. Her grandfather, I think his name is Abram. He's the patriarch of the Moore house, and he used to be an apostle to the prophet. The prophet whose name is like Grant. Grant? His name is Grant? That's too modern of a name. The prophets' names are interesting. The other one is David Ford. David Ford sounds like he wants to be a country star, and he used his dad's money to get him to the Billboard Top 100. That's who David Ford sounds like. Grant? Grant sounds like he's going to be doing my accounting. And then their son is named Ezra. Biblical name. Abram, biblical name. Isaac, biblical name. And then Grant. David Ford. What? Abram is the patriarch, and we would sort of expect him to have a lot of disdain for Emmanuel. He is a man in this system. He doesn't really need to treat the women in his life good. None of the other men treat the women in their life very well. But Abram loves Emmanuel. That is like a narrative constant for Abram, is that he loves Emmanuel, and he is never going to betray her, and he is always going to support her no matter what happens. That is the one thing that is true about him throughout the entirety of the story, and I didn't expect that, and I actually really loved that sort of dynamic, because, technically Emmanuel is the reason why he loses his position as an apostle, because she is a biracial child, and the fact that Emmanuel's mother rejected the prophet and ran out into the woods. All of these things sort of, contributed to the Moore family falling out of fortune, and it would be very easy for Abram to blame Emmanuel, but he doesn't. There is a song called Leave Luann. It's a part of a musical called 33mm, and one of the lyrics is, "A caution to the cruelest of men, God loves Luann, praise be and amen." And that really is the dynamic between Abram and Emmanuel. Abram loves Emmanuel, and I think he would burn the world for her. And then we have Emmanuel's grandmother. So I can't remember her name, I'm sorry. but she's also a very fantastic character. I think it's really interesting to see the way that women acquire, use, and then sometimes abuse powers in systems set up against them. I think it's a very interesting thing to see and explored in fiction. And she pretty much embodies that because she knows that the Moore family is a breath away from execution or exile, both terrible options. And because she's a woman, she can't really protect Emmanuel the way that Abram can. All she can do to save the Moore family is to sort of sacrifice Emmanuel by betraying her and reporting her to the prophet because Emmanuel's grandmother cannot support her. She can't go out of her way to help her in a way that Abram could because the system is really just set up against women. So her grandmother really has no choice but to betray her because, well, she does have a choice. Like, she doesn't really want the system to change. She just wants to get through the system and die peacefully, kind of thing. She doesn't want to change. She just wants to survive. So she does have a choice, but in that she doesn't want to change. She just wants to survive. In that, of course, she was going to betray Emmanuel. Emmanuel is threatening her way of life, and so, she is willing to sacrifice a family member if that means that she and the rest of her family survive. These are good characters with complex emotions and motivations, and it all feeds into what Bethel is, and it works very well, and I really, really liked them. I think Judith, the character Judith, she's a missed opportunity. She's one of the prophet's many wives, and she has an affair with Ezra, which is the prophet's son and Emmanuel's love interest. And Judith and Ezra have no biological relation, and in fact are about the same age. So it's not as weird as I'm stating this sounds, because like they are the same age. But anyways, Judith gets caught with this affair and she gets punished, and Judith up until this point is very antagonistic towards Emmanuel. She's very rude and racist towards Emmanuel, and even though she is this kind of awful person, we don't feel good that she gets caught and punished. Emmanuel doesn't see this as a victory. We don't see this as a victory because contrition is basically you get thrown into a prison and like are physically harmed as you confess your sins and do penance or contrition. It's brutal. It's awful. And it's a very sad way to go. And then the last time we see Judith, she comes back at the end when Emmanuel is caught between getting burned or getting married to the prophet, two terrible options. She is brought out and she gives this like testimony to like confirm that Emmanuel is a witch, and it's very clear that Judith has been coached. And you could extrapolate, theorize that Judith was probably promised that if she does this, she can leave contrition. Which is, again, very sad. I feel a lot for Judith. And at the end of the novel, the prophet makes it out alive and he's spared by Emmanuel. But I think it should have been Judith to be spared by Emmanuel, because there's a lot of emotional energy in Judith that isn't with the prophet. Because Judith is antagonistic from the get-go. We don't really see a lot of antagonism from the prophet until the very end of the novel. And I think, sparing the prophet because killing him would make me as bad as him is kind of a boring way to go. I think sparing Judith is a genuinely hard thing for Emmanuel to do, and a hard thing for readers. I feel like it would divide readers whether or not that was a good choice or not, and I think that would be an interesting piece of discourse, whether or not you agreed with Emmanuel to spare Judith. Because honestly, nobody thinks that the prophet should have been spared. A lot of the negative reviewers are very frustrated at this, and I am also one of those people where it's like, no, he's a terrible person and he needs to answer for his crimes, but there are other characters in this story that we could have spared to get that same emotional catharsis at the end. Recognize that Judith as a victim of the system that did give her power. She was a wife of the prophet and she used that power for ill, yes, but the system was still set up against her. Let's talk about dialogue. The dialogue was good. It never felt stilted to me. Something that I really loved about the dialogue in this book and Emmanuel's voice is, for the lack of a better term, the Bethlen dialect. The words they use. There's a lot of religious language in everyday life which helps put a focus on what this city values and what they fear, like the fact the woods is seen as female and the city is seen as male. Other cities are called heathen cities. I think the men are described to have received miracles and blessings, but women do witchcraft and sorcery. Like, it says a lot about the city with what language they use. It is a very subtle piece of world building that Henderson takes full advantage of, and I think it pays off. There's this game called Chants of Sennaar. It's a retelling of the Tower of Babel, and in the game, because you don't speak anyone's languages, you have to figure out the languages yourself. And there's a lot of emotional and subtle storytelling in how these languages translate into each other. The one that I'm thinking of is that there are soldiers, there's a language for the soldiers, and then there's a language for the bards. And in the soldiers' language, there is a word called for the chosen. It's just called the chosen. But in the bard's language, that same word is just bard. And so it tells you a lot about how the soldiers see bards if in their language it's the chosen. And obviously the bards don't see themselves as a chosen people, they just see themselves as bards. But that has a lot of storytelling in it in just one of these translations. And that is sort of the dynamic we see in how people of Bethel say certain things. It tells you a lot about what they are afraid of and what they value. Let's talk about atmosphere. So, Bethel is a city-state with puritanical beliefs, racial stratification, and the plot theme setting dialogue really bring this environment to life. You could tell me that the Scarlet Letter takes place in Bethel, and I would believe you. I have one small detail, and this is not a critique of the book itself. I just think it's interesting, and I want to share it. This Bethel did not feel Protestant enough. So Puritans are Protestants who basically thought the Church of England was not Protestant enough, so that I don't want to call them Protestant radicals, but, you know, they're sort of known for saying the Church of England was not Protestant enough. So Protestant Puritans, same branch. But this book did not feel Protestant enough to me, and that is not the fault of Alexis Henderson at all. It is because she decided to do puritanical society with a real magic system. And when you put those together, you accidentally get Catholicism. So Protestantism, especially American Protestantism, is very de-ritualized. The least magical and least ritualized they can make the religion, the better. We also see this in Buddhism in America. Buddhism in America is seen as very logical and very scientific, but if you go over into how Asian countries practice Buddhism, you will see that there's a lot more ritual, a lot more magic, and a lot more meldings with the cultures around it. Buddhism is kind of a religion that can fill in the cracks of around other cultures and sort of adapt to it. It's a very adaptive religion. American culture tries to make religion as non-religion-y as possible because ritual and tradition were seen as something as backwards and uncivilized. It's the idea that doing something just because this ritual says so is weird. That's what they believe. And if you're and fundamentalists don't see drawing conclusions from the Bible as any part of any ritual. In case you were wondering, like, but Protestants and fundamentalists, they do a lot of things just because the Bible says so. Like, they do. They just try to stay away from things that feel very ritualistic like as much as possible. And that is also why we have like a blatant disrespect for closed cultural practices here in America. American Protestantism de-ritualizing and desacredizing their own religion gives them a superiority complex, and then they kind of demand all the other religions in America to do the same thing, and when they don't, these religions are labeled as backwards and primitive and uncivilized. This push of de-ritualization is also another thing used to undermine the Native American religions that were happening in and still are happening in America, because ritual is very important to them, because ritual is pretty much important to every religion. You doing things to engage with your spirituality is very important in most religions, and Protestantism has rituals. They do. Mass is inherently a ritual. Marriage is inherently a ritual. They have just taken as much of the religion-y parts as possible to where it doesn't feel like a ritual. If that doesn't make sense, it's because it doesn't. It's because it doesn't. Anyways, this is a fantasy story where magic is real, and that gives the city a much more Catholic spin than a Puritan spin. The word, like, hocus pocus is actually, like, making fun of Catholic Eucharist. It's derived from words that priests say during that ritual. Catholics believe that during Eucharist you are actually eating the body and blood of Christ, and actual transmutation has occurred. Protestants typically believe that it's symbolic. This is also why a lot of Catholic churches will still serve wine, whereas Protestant ones might use grape juice or something else non-alcoholic. Because Catholics believe that it is a genuine transfiguration, you have to use bread and you have to use wine, and subbing it out would render the ritual profane. Again, this is not a criticism. I just think it's really interesting that it's kind of hard to do Protestantism with a genuine magical system. But I mean, you know, for all intents and purposes, this does not inherently feel like magic. This doesn't feel specifically fantasy Catholic. I think she does a very good job of combining Protestantism and a real magic system. I think this worked well, especially because of the witch trials. You know, all of these things was a recipe that worked. I just think that this is interesting, that I was like, this feels Catholic coded. Now it's time to talk about theme. Here, theme is where we struggled the most, and honestly where we lost the star, because I rated this book 4 stars. Now, this is Alexis Henderson's debut novel. I think with that comes a little bit more patience and understanding on my part. Writing a novel is hard. Getting published is harder. You know, given what she was trying to do thematically, I do think she never intended to put herself in this corner, but we're going to talk about it. So, the major theme that Henderson is exploring is the way that patriarchal systems are set up against women, and how it abuses them and throws them away, while the male population can do those same things but can still succeed. There's a difference in treatment. Women in Bethel are subjugated and often blamed for misfortune, while the men of Bethel can get away with just about anything and not be affected. This is a dynamic that a lot of women are very familiar with. Now let's go back to Salem, Massachusetts. It's important to remember that Salem did not hang witches. They hanged women and men, but also women. Witchcraft, as defined by these trials, did not exist. Historically, with a lot of witch trials can be attributed to someone wanting a widow's lands or possessions of some sort. The people who made these accusations, when they die, St. Peter himself is gonna punt them off the staircase. Okay? He has no time for this shit. Moses said it himself. Stop coveting your neighbor's fucking wife. Stop it. Punt. So when we talk about these real trials, it's deeply entrenched in toxic patriarchy and inherently anti-women, because the foundation of this trial is false. Witchcraft, as defined by these trials, it wasn't real. That's not real religion or real magic or real spirituality. None of that was real. We understand everyone hanged in these, or hanged or killed in these witch trials to be innocent because of this. Now, in the year of the witching, magic is real, and women can and do wield it. So do men, but that's like church sanctioned. It's very clear that the magic system is, again, built against women and supports men, and it plays into these themes. But if we want to talk about, the church's foundation for female oppression being unfounded, it becomes a difficult sell when the four witches of Darkwood come to destroy Bethel, both innocent and guilty parties, and are very clearly written and understood as the bad guys. The four witches in the woods are also bad guys. I thought we were going to learn, I mentioned this before, that Lilith, Delilah, Mercy, and Yael were like wives of David Ford, because they have like a version of the marriage seal on their foreheads, and then the women of Bethel are often described as bruised and broken with split lips, and the witches also have those same descriptions, so I was like, oh, these are the same thing. But we never got that. Bethel believes that these witches are wicked, and Emmanuel has to defeat them in order to save the day. And all the while, the man, the prophet, who caused pretty much all of this to happen the way it did, is spared because killing him makes Emmanuel just as bad as him. Why? The novel wants to believe that Bethel is wrong. So is Bethel actually wrong if all of their fears are actually manifesting in the dangers of witchcraft? If it's that Bethel is wrong because they're depicting women in this way, but women are acting in this way, is Bethel wrong then? That becomes the question. Miriam Moore is driven insane and tricked by Lilith to bring Emmanuel into this world, to seal her soul or whatever, to bring upon these plagues. Lilith is clearly the bad guy. And, doesn't that reinforce that magical women are dangerous, that women are dangerous, that nothing good comes out of the woods? Why isn't this book looking at the people who drove those women into the woods? Why don't we know anything about why those women are in the woods to begin with? Again, I don't think Alexis Henderson meant for this contradiction to exist because of how much time she spent on the themes of women in a toxic patriarchal society. I think she was trying to channel the inherent victimhood of Salem witch trials, but that victimhood is unanimously accepted because, again, witchcraft as defined by those trials did not exist. And in Bethel, magic does exist. So we can't say everyone is unanimously a victim, because what if there are people like Lilith who are using witchcraft for evil purposes and using magic to lead people like Miriam and Emmanuel astray? So here's what worked for me. As a reader, I really liked the pacing. I think the epigraphs before each chapter were really interesting and a good way to world build without feeling like we were getting lore dumped at. The world building itself is phenomenal. I really felt that Bethel was a real place and that the society was real. It was very good. I liked the biblical parallels. The Christ parallels were very present and very good. If you don't know, Emmanuel is a way that Christ is referred to as. So she is, you can't, in naming her Emmanuel, you cannot sort of divide her from a sort of Christ-like comparison. She's probably, one of the only characters who kind of looks like Christ, too. Here are the things that kind of worked. The theme, again, kind of worked. It was all there. There's just a couple of thematic contradictions that happen right at the end. But for the most part, the theme is theming. I still don't like the name David Ford. This is the Tiffany problem, where Tiffany is a very popular nickname for women in the 14th century, but if you read a book that took place in the 14th century and a girl was named Tiffany, you would get pulled out because Tiffany sounds like a very modern name. David Ford is the same problem. Ford is too modern. Blame the truck company. And the things that didn't work for me, I didn't like Miriam Moore as a character. She just didn't function very well and was contradictory, and I think that the plot at its weakest was everything to do with Miriam Moore, kind of up until the end. Like, everything leading up to Miriam Moore and the witchcraft was fine, but once we got into the witchcraft with Miriam Moore and like the nature of the curse and how Emmanuel is connected to it, it started to fall apart. And then this book has an epilogue that is just the last chapter, and that's a pet peeve of mine. Just don't call it an epilogue, just have it as the last chapter. And then finally, case study. So if you are a writer or you're someone who is learning how to write, why would you read this book? I think this book is a great way to learn effective uses of the epigraph, so the thing that comes before the chapter. There are some books that they have like 5 epigraphs before the first chapter, and they're just like other quotes from other books, and like it annoys me, especially on audiobook, because you just get quote, 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 and you're like, why are all of these quotes here? Holy God, there's a lot. But every chapter has an epigraph here, and it's just a very good way to do world building. So I think that would be, if you're like wanting to know an effective way of using epigraphs, this is a good book to read. I think if you want to know how to do a fast-paced novel well, this is a good book to case study. And for a biblical fantasy, this is very good. Puritanical biblical fantasy, this is a great book to case study if you're trying to write a book like that. This is the one I would recommend. This is the most indulgent part. I love book tags on Goodreads. None of my book tags are helpful. It's just a moment where I get to be funny, or I just get to organize things in wildly specific categories. So here's how I tagged this book. I tagged it in 2024 because I read it in 2024. Easy one. It also got tagged with CPS is on the way. Minors are harmed in this book. Most of it is on the fault of the parents. I want to say Emmanuel's friend's name is Leah. She's the one who gets the brunt of it. So, poor Leah. CPS is on the way. I tagged this as favorite because I really did love this book. I rated it 4 stars. I can't wait for the sequel. I tagged this as fragile men energy because the men in this book do not handle female rejection well. And the prophet gets rejected once and then makes it everybody's problem for the next like 2 decades. Calm down, sir. I tagged this as last chapter epilogues. Yes, I tracked the books where the epilogue is just the last chapter because that's how much I am pet peeved by it. I tagged this as religion-y. Again, Theater of the Witching is a biblical fantasy that draws upon pagan, Christian, and Jewish folklore and myth to build the world of Bethel. I also tagged this under a strange relationship with death. Emmanuel's mom dies during childbirth, and death is the central plot to the novel. I think this book definitely has a strange relationship with death. I also tagged this on supporting women's wrongs, because I don't think Lilith was necessarily wrong. Okay? I get that she's the bad guy, but I kind of think she was right. And I mean, Emmanuel breaks like every single law during the course of this book. Any law that could be broken, Emmanuel has broken it. And honestly, good for her. She deserves it. And then finally, I've tagged this under women and power. Again, I think how women acquire, use, and sometimes abuse power in systems set against them, I think that's very interesting, and I love to see that play out in a novel. And this book is ripe with it. Seeing Judith, loved it. Emmanuel's grandmother, loved it. Loved this book. Loved everything about it. Art is subjective, and attempting to assert any form of objectivity onto art is honestly a waste of time. You can't even say that good grammar is necessary in novels because there are genres where fragmentation is a central part, and there are audiences for those genres. I think everyone wants high quality novels. We all just have varying different opinions on what constitutes a high quality novel. So whether you loved this book to the point where it's a hill you're willing to die on, or you hated it with the passion of 1,000 suns, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts and how you thought about this novel. I'd love to hear your interpretations. And with that, the madness has ended. You can go in peace, and I will see you next time when we delve into the delirium again.